Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we'll be working on creating a full-stack application similar to Jira and Asana, which are task management softwares. Probably your company uses something similar to create, organize, and manage work and share this work among teammates. So let's get started. This is how it's going to look like. We're gonna have authentication, which will enable you to log in using your email. Then we have the option to create tasks, edit the existing tasks, and also move tasks around in different columns over here to show the different status. As for the stack that we'll be using, we're going to use TypeScript as a programming language. For the React framework, we're going to use Next.js, which manages API routing, server-side rendering. If you want to learn more specifically about Next.js, I do have a series in which I go over Next.js more deeply. For the server, we're going to be using Apollo server as the GraphQL server. Also for the GraphQL client, we'll use Apollo client. Then for the schema, we're going to use Nexus to construct the GraphQL schema. As for the database, to connect our code into the database, we're going to use Prisma as our ORM. As for our database, it's going to be relational, and we're going to use PostgreSQL. This is a lot of technologies together, I know, but as we build this project, I'm gonna go over and explain single one of them into more details. So let's actually get started with the writing code. First things first, to create the project, I have my VS Code open here on the left, and then I'm going to be copying this command from Next.js documentation. Since we are also using TypeScript in this project, we are gonna copy the one that has the little the TS flag next to it. So yeah, let's copy this, paste it in our terminal for VS Code, and give it a minute. Give the name of the project. I'm gonna give Jira Asana Clone for now. Alright, it's ready. We're gonna go to the project directory, and next thing that we'll do to set up the backend is that we need to install the Prisma dependency, Prisma CLI. It's recommended to install it locally in your project versus globally, just because in case, here's the dependency. So in case if you have other projects that are also using Prisma, you might have version conflicts. So to avoid these conflicts, and also if another developer downloads your project, they don't have Prisma CLI, they're gonna get an error. So that's the best way to do it. Let's also give this one a minute. Now that it's installed, we are going to initiate a basic Prisma setup using this command and npm prisma init. This will create two files, one in our Prisma directory, which is the schema.prisma. This is your main Prisma configuration file that will contain your database schema. Another file is env file, which is like a .env file to define the database connection URL, and you can also use this for other sensitive information and other environment variables. So for this database URL, you can use the local host, or you can use a service like Heroku to host your database, which is what I'll be doing. So if you want to follow along, that you'd have to replace your URL from the URL that we'll get in Heroku. So for Heroku, I already have an account. Basically, you can create a new developer account, which is free, and then you'll get a dashboard. I already have created an app, so I'm not gonna go through the steps, but how you create is for you press new, you create new app. Once you have that created, this is the dashboard, how it's gonna look like. You're gonna go to, I already have installed Heroku Postgres add-on, but you have to go through resources, look up Heroku Postgres and install it, which is also free. We need Postgres because our database once again would be PostgreSQL. Your credentials tab. Yes, you'll press that, and then inside the settings you're gonna have database credentials, and you'll press view credentials. This will give you the URL to copy and paste it here. Before we start editing our schema, let's take a quick look on how Prisma helps us do it. So as I mentioned, using Prisma, it's very easy to connect your PostgreSQL database to your code and then update your database. The data model is very easy to define, and it's also very easy to read. You can see an example of this model of post here. Supports the languages that we'll be using: JavaScript, TypeScript, and then PostgreSQL for the database. It is also type safe, which is convenient for us since we're using TypeScript. It does have some Visual Studio packages that you can install. The migrations and updating the schema is very easy. Once you update this file, you just run npx Prisma migrate or the push to push the changes. And the browser, we're going to also take a look at the browser, which is very simple way you can browse the data in your Chrome browser, for example. And then it does integrate very easily with GraphQL, Apollo, which also we'll be using. Alright, let's update the schema. So to think what kind of models we need, mainly it would be two models: a user who would log in, and then the task, which is like a task that would be assigned to the user. So for first, we will need some user credentials. So here we have ID, name, email, since we have email login, email verified. We're gonna set up authentication later. For now, we're just gonna create users. Image, in case we want to set a profile picture. Role, which will be two types of roles. We're going to have a subscribed role and the free role. For now, we're not going to set up subscriptions. This is just for an example, so you know how to use enums. And then we'll also create this model, which is task. Task will have ID. Every model needs like a unique identifier. It will have title, description, and then here you can see how we define relationships in Prisma, which is using this relation keyword. So from here, this is one to many relationship, as in one user can have many tasks, and then each task user is optional because you know, there's like, we can create unassigned tasks in Jira or Asana, but if we want to assign it to user, we are going to use store user ID in the task. And then status is, for example, if it's in progress, review, done, or etc. Our changes to the database, that's done by command npx prisma db push. It's gonna read the environment variables from this env file that we have, and it should push our changes that we made in the schema. Once that's done, we are gonna run the command to alright, so it also generated Prismaclient. We're gonna use the Prismaclient to fetch the data on the client side, but now let's run the command for the studio, which is npx prisma studio. That should open a studio in our browser. The port is localhost 555, all the models that we created, which is task and user. It is pretty easy to navigate. At the moment it shows that there is no data because we never added it, and then in this table we can see all our fields. So there's two ways. Just because we have not created any queries yet, there is no data here, but just for your information, there's two ways to like manually like push data, I guess, to the database. It's either by creating seed.typescript file inside Prisma folder, and then in that file you create objects that you want to push and then run the script to push it. But the other way, that which I prefer and is more like user friendly, is just creating it from here. So I'm gonna do that. It automatically will create ID and it will say created it now. The title, so we're creating task now, so let's say title create mockup. Description would be just description for now. We're gonna set user as null because we don't have any users. The status, it would also be null. So let's save this. So Prisma helped us like structure our database. Now in order to be able to access our database from Next.js using Prisma, we'll first need to install Prismaclient in our app. So as I remember, it came as one of the dependencies. We can check here. Yeah, so Prismaclient is already installed. So what we can do is we can configure it. So we want to use a single Prisma instance that we can import into any file wherever we need to. So in order to be able to do that, we need to create this lib folder here. So and inside the lib folder, we're gonna create Prisma TypeScript file. Here we'll paste this code. So we have to use this workaround because of how Next.js works, and it has a fast refresh. So every time we hit the save, we don't want to create like new instance of the client. We just want to use the one that's global. So now like Prisma type is not relevant since this is like a configuration code. Now let's set up our GraphQL endpoint. A few words about GraphQL. It's a query language which becoming more popular. Yeah, a lot of companies are using it. It's easy to use and you don't need to fetch like all the data at once. You can choose which data you want to fetch. For example, if Hero has like the model of Hero has maybe like 10 or 15 other variables, you don't need to define all of them. You can just name the ones you want to API endpoint to return, and it will return exactly that. You can also combine like different resources in a single request, and then it's also like typed, which is convenient and again to use with TypeScript. Alright, for this we do need to install a few packages now. We'll also need a new folder for GraphQL in which we will save our schema as well as resolvers and the context. For the schema, we'll create the schema file, but for now we're gonna leave it empty just because we're gonna use another library, Nexus, which is like a construction library for GraphQL schema, so it will automatically generate our schemas. We'll set that up later. Next thing we need to do is create the resolver function, so new file also for that. Resolvers.typescript. In here we can import the Prisma instance that we created previously, so it would be from library Prisma. and then we export resolver. In this case, we'll create just a query that returns tasks. So it'd be async function, parents, arguments, context, and then find many. So resolver has three optional arguments. Parent, which is the return value of the resolver for this field's parent. Since it's not being used in the resolver, we are prefixing it with the underscore. Arguments also, which is an object that contains all GraphQL arguments provided for a field. For example, if we have a query that we need to pass an ID or something, the args object will include the ID field. And then context argument is helpful for passing things that any resolver might need, like authentication scope, database connections, and custom fetch functions. In this case, for our context, we are using the Prismaclient. And let's go ahead also and create context inside GraphQL folder. Context.TypeScript. We would also import Prismaclient from our dependency. And then import the instance that we already created in the lib folder. And export it. As Prisma. And this will return promise, which will contain context. So what we're doing is that we are creating a context type and then attaching Prismaclient to it. After that, we're exporting a synchronous function, which is called createContext, that returns Prisma instance, which we created in lib directory. And then we'll need this context later in the GraphQL file, which actually will create the file right now. So to create the GraphQL endpoint, we're going to be making use of Next.js's API routes. So the way to use API routes is that any file that's created inside Page's API would be mapped to the API and then dash name of the file endpoint, and it would be treated as just any other API endpoint. So we can go ahead and create endpoint for our tasks, like to fetch, I guess, all the tasks, the API, new file. Then we'll paste this configuration and replace this with the name of the file. So what's going on here is that we are creating new Apollo server instance, which takes the schema and resolvers that we created as a parameter, and then we create a function named start server in here, which calls Apollo server to start it. Then we have handlers, which take request and response object, And then inside of this function, we're first calling the start server, and then the create handler function while setting this is the path to the API, so the endpoint of our GraphQL. And then this can resolve export configuration object, and then this can have like default configurations. I mentioned to generate schema, we'll be using this Nexus library, which is, it's like a GraphQL schema construction library. It is type safe. It lets us declare types using code like in a very simple way. It's also very like easy to read, and handles our GraphQL schema generation based on the types that we create. I'm going to include the links of all the frameworks that I mentioned in this video in the description. So let's start using Nexus, npm install Nexus. While that's happening, let's go over to GraphQL. We're going to create a types folder inside GraphQL. Here we have, as you guys remember, we have two types, which is user and task. So let's go ahead, create files for both. And we're going to create one index file also to combine and export both of these types together. Let's start with the task, and then for this we also need to look into the schema to see what kind of fields and we had for our task, and then what types they were. So here we're going to import few of the things that we will need from the Nexus library. And then we'll also import our user, because we are actually making reference to the user in our type task. So to create the object type, we just use this function from Nexus object type. We give it a name, then definition would be all the fields that it has, and as you can see, it matches the fields that we described in the Prisma schema. So ID created it, all this, and then if the field is of type list array, then we use this like list field. And then it takes the type user, which we imported from over here, and it takes the Prisma context as well, and then finds the user, where user ID is same as to the ID passed to it, and then it does return users. We also can define queries using Nexus, so we will do that using this function, where for the query we're not using object type anymore, we're using extend type, and we're going to have two types of queries. First query would be get all tasks query, which we're gonna get again Prisma context, task object, and then this function find many. It's a Prisma function. And then we'll have another one, which is get task by user ID. We get the task, we pass it to like the user ID, and then we find many tasks, because one user can have many tasks. Every task that matches the specific user ID that we passed. So that's how, and then as for example, like REST APIs have like get update functions for the update. Here we have so like in GraphQL, the concept of update is called mutation. So this is how we define mutation, again with the extend type. So we need different kinds of mutation. First would be create a new task, in which this is how we define arguments. If argument is required, then we would say non-null, which is also like a function from Nexus, and then the argument types is defined either like string arg, which also we're importing over here, or it could be, we have an example of integer, I think, also. So if, yeah, this would be integer arg. I guess in here we don't have it yet. And then also we define what kind of data we want to return. So in this case, it would be all the fields of the task. Next one is update task by ID. Then again, we need the fields that we are like updating, and then all the updated fields returning. So the way we find which task to update is again passing like argument ID. And for deletion, we also need ID, and this will just make use of the Prisma function, delete. This is it for the task. Now let's go to users. This would be also mostly like similar steps where we have to go through. We're gonna import all the functions that we're going to need. We're going to import the task. For the user object, yeah, let's take a look at again the object in our Prisma schema, and we're gonna create the object that's matching the fields to that. This is it for the object, and this would be our query. Here we have two types of queries. First one is get all user, which just returns all the users using find many. And then another one which we'll also need is get user by email. So we pass in this argument email, and then we find unique user because every user has a unique email, so there's no matching to users that have the same email. Alright, here we have the field is of type row. So since we're only using row inside user, we're gonna define row as enum here. So enum type is also a function imported from Nexus. We give it a name, and members is kind of like options for the enum. And then let's import both of these types inside index. So it would be, export them, so it would be easier to import in like the files that we would use them. I'm gonna go back to our schema and add some configuration here. So usually in GraphQL you define your schema, but instead of us creating schema, what we'll do is that we'll make use of Nexus functions to create schema for us. So this would be make schema, and we'll pass all the types that we created previously, our index file which has the types imported, and what this will do is this will generate schema inside the GraphQL folder and in the schema.graphql file. As for the context, we're also passing the context. Actually, this is by accident. The GraphQL folder Okay, let's move it. It says we have not installed this module. Okay, we can just install it. npm install. Because so there was that it cannot find a file for module microcourse, which we then checked in package.json, and we do have this installed as a dependency, but then if you see another error is that it can't find the type. So this is actually a TypeScript error. So sometimes for certain modules, because they're third-party modules, they don't include the types. So you have to, if you're using TypeScript, this is good to know that you have to install their type separately. Alright, let's restart our server. Navigate to the API endpoint, which was API tasks. Here we're presented with Apollo server. We can query our server and directly make GraphQL queries in the browser. So let's do that. So here, as you remember, we defined two types of queries. Oh, I accidentally pressed it. So two types of queries, which were tasks and users, and then task fetch by user ID here, and then user fetch by email. So let's go ahead and run tasks query. So this plus sign should add the, we don't need this example, so this plus sign should add the query, and then we can indicate like which fields we want returned. Let's just try. Let's add this and let's run the query. As you can see, we did get our one task that we created. The next thing that we want to do is that use all these queries on the client side and start building UI components to fetch all this. So for this one, we're going to use Apollo GraphQL server. I'm going to paste this as the name of the module. And while this is installing, we would have to go back to our lib folder and create a new file named apollo.typescript. And we'll paste the following code in there. This is also just the configuration. So we're passing some of the functions from the Apollo client, and we're also passing our GraphQL URI. So this will return, this will basically create new Apollo client instance, which also has this cache field. It's basically, this is instance of in-memory cache, which Apollo client uses to cache query results after fetching them. Sometimes we do want to fetch some data from the API, but we do also want to fetch them. So now what we want to do is we want to go to our main app folder, which is app.ts. Here we want to import our Apollo provider. And we also want to import the Apollo client instance that we created from lib Apollo file. And then wrap the global app component with Apollo provider. So all of our project's components would be able to send GraphQL queries. So Apollo provider is basically like a wrapper, and then as a client we pass our Apollo client. In Next.js, we create page by creating a new file under pages folder. Import.tsx. And here we import React, and later on we're gonna use also use state and use effect hooks, so might as well import them now. And we would have to import GraphQL functions so we can define the queries. Also use query, which is kind of like a query hook from our Apollo client.
Alright,
if we go to this schema file that was generated by Nexus, we can find our queries here. So we have a tasks query. We're gonna create a new constant, name it all tasks query. use the GQL tag. And query keyword to indicate we're defining query, name of the query, and then name of the query, and then what fields we want to return. Let's just return all the fields we have available, which is ID. So here we're going to get ID, title, description, and status. And now actually create our board component itself. And export it at the end. We'll just return div for now, just to make sure. Okay, let's have this open and also navigate to our board page. Just to make sure it's loading. Alright, now we're gonna use this use query from Apollo client, and this use query return contains 3 objects, and then we can destructure this object. So this are data itself, and then loading and error states. So we can use loading and error to display, like, let's say, loading indicator, and then use query takes the name of the query. In this case it would be all tasks query. What we can do is that it does have another optional argument, which is onCompleted, and you can pass the function that you want it to execute once the data has been fetched. So in this case, what we'll do is we're going to take the data and console log it so we can see it in the console. Alright. So open the console. Oh, we do see the object is returned. It contains tasks, and we do see our one task here. Alright, the next thing we'll do is we'll create a component so we can nicely display all these tasks. In order to do that, let's set up the layout first. If you remember the mockup, we had navigation bar at the top, and then board was below this navigation bar. In order to create the layout and export it, have it available globally, like on every page, we will first create it in components and then export it. So we do not have components folder. Alright, we're going to create components folder. New folder. Where we'll save reusable UI components. And here let's create another folder, layout. So this layout would consist of the header, which is also going to be placed on every page. So let's first create that. Import React. Oops. For the styling, I'm going to be using React Bootstrap component library. the reason, if you have used Bootstrap before, the styling, like the class names and everything, is very similar, and it has also like the React version of components. So let's install this library. I'll also link the URL of this library so you can take a look at documentation and maybe explore their other components. So once that loaded, we would be able to import navigation bar, also container in which we would wrap everything, and then button. Create our header, make it export default. And we're gonna return everything in navigation bar. Navigation bar automatically sticks to the top, so we don't have to worry about like styling. Whatever we place in here would automatically appear at the top. Wrap everything in the container. So navigation bar brand, we're gonna give it a name. Let's name project management. So this is what I'm using as a reference. So we would have the name on the left, and then on the right we would have user, maybe even a button, and then this is, as you can see, it's like responsive. It adjusts the way depending on like the screen size, but then this this is on the left, this is on the right, so that's what we can copy from here. And then we'll add another button here, which actually would be a link. For now we would leave the link empty, but in order to create links you can't really use you can use ahref, but the next way of doing things would be to import a next link. And then in here, create link, href equals empty for now. Then inside we have a button. Then we say log out. And here, so if you're creating a link, then this would usually work when you pass href. Just because link has button wrapped inside it, we want button to redirect us to the link. So what you need to do is that you need to pass href. So this would pass the href to its child component. Now we need to include the header. Let's create index dot TypeScript file. Well, header should be inside the layout folder. Import React and import, just because this was a default export, we don't need to indicate the curly brackets around the header. So the layout will take children, as in like React nodes, and it will display header first, followed by children components. For now, we're gonna leave type any and return. class name we want display flags. All the styling is coming also from like Bootstrap. And then height we want 100. Header goes here. And we display the children object in here. Now export default layout. The layout, but we need to wrap our like main file inside the layout. So we have this open up here. Let's import the layout first. And as long as it's wrapped around all the component, it doesn't matter if it's inside the Apollo provider or outside, because the Apollo provider just provides the data, not like the styling. Alright, if we reload this page right now, we should be able to see. Okay, so I think Bootstrap might have not been loaded. Let's see. React.bootstrap. For the packages, make sure if you're using like the same versions as I am, because I know there is a new version of GraphQL, I think it's 16, that's not fully compatible with the new version of Next. So I think they're having some issues. So before we resolve that, I want you to come across those like errors because of dependencies incompatibility. So yeah, just letting you know, but still leave a comment, maybe I'll be able to. Telling the Bootstrap for like the Bootstrap CSS to be loaded per their documentation, which I'll also include in the description. We would have to import their CSS file in our like main application file. So let's do that in app.tsx, and let's just do just in case in here in our index. So yeah, after that we should be able to load the styles. Load what we have here. So this is our navigation bar as we created, and then this is our board underneath. If you, let's change styling a little bit, but we're not gonna spend too much time on it. If you inspect here, this is, so the board, like the child of this, like the layout, this page does not have the full height, it only has the height of the one div that it's containing. So for some reason, Next does this weird, it adds like an ID on top of every page, and then this ID, I guess, the main div does not have height, so it usually like shrinks our component. So let's fix that by going to, we do have a main styles file, which is global.css. So let's update a little bit of styling here. First, give it a height, as I mentioned. Also, we're gonna give height to that ID that of Next. So we're gonna make it display flags. Direction of the flags would be column, and then height once again would be 100%. So by default, when we're creating a button, it's considered like a primary class in React Bootstrap. And then it's styling for button primary. It has different styling for secondary. For example, let's change the class here. Yeah, it will be different color, but we can override all the styling by just targeting the names of this. So if we go ahead here and say routine.primary, update the background color, and paste some hexes to give you guys an example of how you can override all this like bootstrap styling, and then we'll also update same color would be like border color. Here it is updated. Let's add some padding to our header. As you notice, this is like right next to each other, so let's change that. To add a padding, we don't need to define styling. We can just use React Bootstrap class name. P is for padding, so this will, and then 3 would just add like a little bit of padding around it. As for the navigation bar, let's add some shadow since our board will also be white, so we need some way to like differentiate that. You can just target nav bar, and I'm just gonna paste the dimensions for the shadow. Alright, now that we have that, let's move back to our board component and start displaying data over there.